The heat was a physical weight pressing down from a bleached white sky, smelling of coal smoke and hot metal. A silence had fallen over the train platform at Millstone Junction, so profound it was a sound in itself, the sound of 100 held breaths and 100 pairs of eyes fixed on one person. On her. Margaret Doyle stood before the man she had traveled 1,000 miles to marry her world, narrowing to the cold final light in his eyes. He spoke and the silence shattered. "I cannot marry you." The words were not shouted, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her fingers, already trembling, went numb. The fine mesh of her veil, meant to be a delicate shroud of modesty, suddenly felt like a cage. The crowd's collective gasp was a distant roar, like the sea pulling back before a tidal wave. Her own blood thundered in her ears, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the stillness of the moment. Her knees gave way. She did not fall so much as sink a slow, boneless collapse onto the splintered wood of the platform. Her small carpet bag slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud that echoed in the vast, empty space her life had just become. As her gloved hands touched the dusty planks, the rough texture jolted a memory loose, and the world dissolved into a storm of orange and red. Fire, the roar of it devouring the walls of their Virginia home, the suffocating heat, the acrid taste of smoke. She was 12, small and terrified, trapped behind a fallen beam in the study. Her father, Samuel Doyle, was there, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild with a fear not for himself, but for her. He heaved the beam, his muscles straining, and pulled her free. A burning tapestry fell from the wall, its fiery edge catching her cheek. The pain was searing, a white-hot agony that stole her breath. He swept her into his arms, carrying her through the inferno, his voice a desperate whisper against her hair. "Be brave, my Maggie Rose. Always be brave." He pressed something small and cool into her palm. A silver locket, his last gift. He pushed her into the arms of a neighbor just as the roof collapsed behind him. Now kneeling on the Wyoming platform, Maggie's hand flew to her neck, her fingers closing around the familiar shape of the locket beneath her dress. The metal was cool against her frantic pulse. The memory of the heat, her father's last words, the legacy of a name branded with treason, it all crashed down upon her. She was not just a woman with a scarred face. She was Samuel Doyle's daughter, a living monument to a shame she could never escape. With a choked sob, she fumbled with the edges of her veil, pulling the fabric down, desperate to hide not just the scar, but the very essence of who she was. Richard Hale did not wait for her to rise. He turned his polished boots, making a sharp, decisive sound on the platform, and walked away without a backward glance. The crowd, its morbid curiosity satisfied, began to dissolve. Voices drifted back to her, sharp and cruel as broken glass. "Serves her right. Daughter of a turncoat. Poor thing. To come all this way for nothing. What did he expect, marrying a trader's girl with a face like that?" Their words were stones, and she was already drowning. Maggie remained on the steps of the depot, a small veiled figure in a pale blue dress, alone with the dust, the silence, and the crushing weight of a name she never asked for. The crowd had vanished as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind only the swirling dust and the mournful whistle of the wind sweeping down from the Laramie Mountains. It carried the scent of pine and distant rain, a clean smell that felt alien in the stifling air of her humiliation. Maggie remained where she had fallen, a small, still island of misery. Her world had shrunk to the few feet of splintered wood beneath her, and she kept her eyes fixed upon it, as if daring to meet anyone's gaze would turn her to stone. From the deep shadows of the depot's porch, a figure emerged. He moved without hurry, his dusty boots making almost no sound. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame carrying the quiet weight of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. At 28, Ethan McGraw wore the Civil War not as a badge of honor, but as a subtle etching in the lines around his eyes. A faint, silvered scar crossed his temple, half hidden beneath a thatch of dark, unruly hair. He wore no hat, no pretense of authority, just a quiet, grounded presence that seemed to absorb the hostility lingering in the air. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in the scene, not with pity, but with a kind of solemn understanding. He did not speak immediately. He simply waited, allowing the silence to settle into something less menacing. Finally, he crouched beside her, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He didn't reach for her, didn't invade her small circle of shame. Instead, his voice came soft and low, a stark contrast to Richard Hale's pronouncement. "Ma'am," he said the word, simple, respectful. He nodded toward her carpet bag. "That yours?" Maggie flinched, pulling the veil tighter. She gave a short, jerky nod, unable to form words. He picked up the bag and set it gently beside her. He remained crouched, his eyes on the horizon, as if giving her the space to breathe. "Storm's coming," he observed. "You got a place to go." A choked, humorless sound escaped her. A place to go. She had spent the last of her money on the train ticket, on the dress, on the foolish hope of a new life. There was no place to go. She shook her head, a small, defeated gesture. Ethan was silent for another long moment. He looked at her, then his gaze direct but not intrusive. He saw the tremble in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched into fists in her lap. He saw not a spectacle, but a person breaking apart. He extended a hand. It was a large hand, calloused and capable, the nails trimmed, but ingrained with the dirt of honest work. He didn't try to pull her up. He simply offered it, a silent invitation. "There's a cabin," he said. "My place. It's not much, but it's dry. And it's quiet." She stared at his hand, at the lifeline it represented. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse to curl into herself and disappear. But the thought of spending the night on this platform, exposed and alone, was even more terrifying. Her fingers trembled as she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, steadying her as he helped her to her feet. He didn't let go until she was stable. Then he picked up her bag and led her toward a simple 2-horse wagon hitched near the water trough. The ride was silent, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the low rumble of distant thunder. They left Millstone Junction behind, traveling toward where the cracked earth of the prairie gave way to the foothills, where pine and rock stood stark against the darkening sky. The cabin was nestled in a small hollow, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. It was built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke drifted. Everything about the place, the mended fence, the neat stack of firewood, the clean-swept porch, spoke of simple, deliberate care. It was a home built by hands, not by money. Inside the cabin was a single room, surprisingly warm and tidy. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bed was tucked into a corner, and a sturdy table stood in the center. Ethan set her bag down. "You can rest here," he said, his voice retaining its quiet, even tone. He nodded toward a kettle on the hearth. "There's tea if you want it." Maggie sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her veil still firmly in place. "I won't be a burden," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I won't stay long." "Didn't figure you would," he replied, his back to her, as he stoked the small fire. He moved with a practiced economy, his presence filling the small space without crowding it. He asked no questions. He offered no false comfort. He simply gave her shelter. That night, she lay fully clothed beneath a thick quilt that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Through the thin walls, she listened to the quiet rustle of Ethan moving about the cabin, the creak of a chair as he sat by the fire, the soft, scrape of a knife as he mended a piece of leather. It was the sound of peace, something she hadn't known in years. She fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, not of comfort, but of sheer bone-deep weariness. Morning arrived with soft gray light filtering through the single window. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Maggie sat up, her body stiff and sore. On the small crate beside her bed sat a tin cup of cool, fresh water. She looked around the cabin. A broken chair that had been in the corner yesterday was now repaired, its leg expertly braced. The floor had been swept clean of mud and debris from the storm. On the table sat a plate with a thick slice of bread and a small pot of honey. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Wherein? She felt a pang of uncertainty. Was this real? This quiet, unassuming kindness. She rose and stepped outside, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She found him by the woodpile, axe in hand, splitting logs with a steady, rhythmic swing. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing strong, corded forearms. His brow was damp with sweat. He did not look up as she approached, but he knew she was there. "I'll be on my way," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. He finished his swing, sinking the axe blade deep into a log. He nodded, once his eyes on his work. Roads that way. His lack of protest was both a relief and a strange sort of disappointment. She turned, her resolve hardening. She would walk back to town, find some work, do anything but accept charity. She made it 5 steps, her gaze fixed on the muddy track that led back to Millstone Junction. Then she stopped. She looked back at the small, sturdy cabin, at the curl of smoke rising from the chimney, at the quiet man who had offered her shelter, without demanding a single thing in return. Not a name, not a story, not even a look. She turned back around. Ethan had stopped his work and was watching her, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the cabin door and held it open. By afternoon, the wind returned, tearing through the trees like a warning. The sky, which had been a clear, washed-out blue, turned the color of a bruise. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that pounded the roof and turned the yard to mud. They worked quickly, a silent, efficient team. He showed her how to pull canvas across the windows, and she helped him tie down the flapping roof of the small chicken coop. Her dress was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but she worked with a frantic energy, grateful for the distraction. Inside, the storm raged. Thunder cracked overhead so close it shook the very foundations of the cabin. Ethan was on a stool, bracing a sagging board above the hearth, when a sound like a rifle shot echoed through the room. "Roof beam," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. The main beam groaned, a terrible splintering sound. Dust and splinters rained down. Maggie looked up and saw the massive log beginning to give way right above where he stood. Without thinking, she lunged forward, grabbed his arm, and yanked him back with all her strength. They fell together, hitting the floor hard as the heavy beam crashed down where he had been standing, an instant before shattering the stool and gouging the floorboards. Silence descended, broken only by the howling wind and the drumming of rain on the roof. They lay breathless side by side on the floor, their hearts hammering in unison. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. "You all right?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "I will be," he said, more to himself than to her. He pushed himself up slowly, wincing as he put weight on his arm. He offered her his hand again, and again she took it. They sat on the floor against the far wall, watching as rain poured through the new hole in the roof, puddling on the floorboards. The fire had been doused by the debris. A cold draft snaked through the room. Maggie shivered, pulling her wet dress closer. Without a word, Ethan took off his heavy canvas coat and laid it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of pine and damp earth. He said nothing more. He did not ask what had made her run toward him. He did not flinch from the glimpse of scarred cheek he must have seen when her veil was knocked askew. For the first time since the fire, Maggie felt something other than fear or shame. Huddled in the dark, storm-battered cabin, a strange and unexpected feeling bloomed in her chest. She felt needed. In the days that followed the storm, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Maggie no longer kept her veil on while inside the cabin. She still drew it over her face when she stepped outside, a habit as ingrained as breathing. But within those four wooden walls, she let the silvered line on her cheek breathe. Ethan never stared. He never looked away either. He simply met her eyes when he spoke, as if the mark were no more remarkable than a freckle. Their days settled into a quiet, companionable rhythm. She mended his torn shirts while he repaired the gate. They rethatched the damaged roof together, working in the bright morning sun, their hands often brushing as they passed shingles or nails. Maggie, drawing on a childhood spent in a home with a proper kitchen, showed him how to make butter from the cream of a neighbor's cow, which he traded for his work. Ethan, in turn, taught her how to sight a rifle, how to tell by the clouds if a storm would be rain or hail, how to brace a loose beam with nothing more than a wedge and instinct. In the evenings, they shared simple meals by the fire. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable understanding. Sometimes they talked. One night, as the kettle steamed and a mournful wind swept down from the mountains, Ethan spoke of his past. "My brother died in the last week of the war," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames, his voice flat with memory. "Cannon fire near Franklin. He was 20, used to whistle this tune, a silly little ditty he made up. Can't get it out of my head sometimes." He paused, turning a piece of wood over in his hands. I held what was left of him, buried him myself. Maggie looked down at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan nodded. When it ended, I rode home, or what was left of it. Town burned, mother gone, land seized by carpetbaggers. So I just kept riding. The fire crackled, filling the space his words had left. Then Maggie spoke, her voice quieter than the hissing kettle. "My father was hanged outside Richmond. They said he passed messages to the Confederacy. Maybe he did. He never told me. I was 12. She clutched the silver locket through her dress. We were forced out of town. My mother, she didn't last 2 winters after that. I was passed between relatives. No one wanted a trader's daughter." Ethan looked at her, then his expression unreadable, but for a deep, resonant empathy in his eyes. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. He just listened. The silence that followed was a bridge between two solitudes, a shared understanding of loss that needed no further words. 2 days later, supplies were low, and Ethan announced he was going into town. He looked at her expectantly. "You could come." Maggie hesitated, her hand instinctively rising toward her face. But the thought of being cooped up in the cabin, waiting and worrying, was worse. She nodded, fetched her bonnet, and carefully pinned her veil in place. At the general store, a kindly gossiping woman named Mrs. Gable gave Maggie a curious but not unkind glance. Maggie kept her head down, her eyes fixed on her shopping list, acutely aware of every stare, every whispered comment from the other patrons. Ethan moved through the aisles with a calm purpose, seemingly oblivious. But he wasn't. Outside, leaning on the porch railing, were 2 men Maggie recognized from the train station. Their voices were low, but carried on the dry air. "Guess Hale finally found something he wouldn't touch," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. McGraw's not so picky. Reckon he's just keeping her warm till he can sell her on. Might be worth a few coins, the other snickered, with a sack over her head. Maggie froze her fingers, trembling so badly she nearly dropped a bag of beans. A cold dread washed over her, the same suffocating shame she'd felt on the platform. Ethan, who was paying Mrs. Gable, heard them. His shoulders stiffened, the muscles in his back bunching into hard knots. But he finished his transaction, picked up the sacks, and walked out without a word. He simply placed a hand on the small of Maggie's back, a brief steadying pressure, and guided her to the wagon. The ride home was heavy with a silence that felt different from their usual quiet. That night, Maggie lay awake long after Ethan had settled into his bedroll by the fire, the cruel laughter echoing in her mind. She touched the scar on her cheek, the flesh cool and numb. How long could this last? How long could a man's quiet kindness withstand the town's open contempt? 3 days passed in tense quiet. Then Ethan went to town alone for a piece of hardware. He was gone longer than usual. When he returned, there was a fresh cut on his cheek and his knuckles were bruised. He said nothing about it, simply went about his chores. But Maggie knew. Word spread as it always did. A drunk at the saloon had sneered loudly, "That quiet one keeps a branded woman in his bed. Wonder if she's as cold as her traitor father." Later, Mrs. Gable would recount to a neighbor how Ethan hadn't thrown a punch. He had simply turned, stepped in front of the man, and spoken in a voice so low and cold it had silenced the entire room. "She is kinder, stronger, and more decent than any man in this town. You will not speak her name again." The drunk had stammered and backed away. That evening, Maggie said nothing. She stirred the stew, her movements stiff and mechanical. While Ethan was outside checking on the horses, she began to pack. It didn't take long. She had so little. Her spare dress, her mother's Bible, the small coin pouch with its few remaining cents. She made it halfway to the gate before his voice stopped her. "Maggie." She kept walking her back ramrod straight. "Maggie, wait." He caught her arm, his grip not hard but firm and unyielding. She stopped but didn't turn around. He stood behind her so close she could feel the warmth of him, his breath short from running. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice strained. "But if you think for 1 second I took you in for anything other than who you are, then you're wrong." She didn't speak, couldn't. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, hidden from his view. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper beside her ear. "I don't see a scar. I don't hear the whispers. When I look at you, I see the woman who pulled me from under a falling roof. I see the woman who can make bread out of dust and hope. I don't need anything else." His voice cracked on the last words. "Just you." Her shoulders began to tremble. With a small broken sound, she dropped her bag in the dirt. And for the first time since she had met him, she turned to face him without instinctively reaching for her veil. Richard Hale was not a man accustomed to being defied. The public humiliation at the train station had been an affront to his pride. Maggie Doyle's continued presence in Millstone Junction, living under the protection of a man he considered little more than a mule driver, was an intolerable insult. The whispers that reached him were laced with mockery. Richard Hale, the town's most powerful man, scorned for a war veteran with nothing to his name but a patch of dirt and a scarred woman. The insult fermented into a cold, calculated rage. He would not be laughed at. He retreated to his study, a room of dark wood and leather-bound books, and stared for a long time at the faded portrait hanging above the mantelpiece. It was a photograph of a stern-faced man in a Union officer's uniform, his own father, Colonel Alistair Hale. Richard touched the cool glass. "Debts must be paid, Father," he murmured to the ghost in the picture. Families must answer for their sins. He sent a wire to the sheriff in Laramie, a man whose loyalties were secured by Hale's considerable financial influence. He made a quiet visit to the town's land deed office. Then he waited. The change came subtly at first. A delivery of seed Ethan had ordered and paid for never arrived. The blacksmith suddenly had no time to reshoe his horses. When he went to town, men who once nodded at him now turned their backs. He returned from one trip with a split lip and a fresh bruise high on his cheekbone. "What happened?" Maggie asked, her hands flying to his face. He gently pushed her hands away. "Ran into a door," he said, his voice flat. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "It'll heal." But the quiet siege was taking its toll. That night, as she sat mending his shirt by the firelight, she watched the tension in his shoulders and the weary set of his jaw. Her chest tightened with a guilt so profound, it was a physical ache. "If I had not come here," she whispered the words, barely disturbing the air, "none of this would have touched you." Ethan looked up from the harness he was oiling, his gaze slow and deliberate. "If you had not come here," he said, his voice low and certain there would be nothing here worth protecting. He put down his work and moved to sit beside her on the hearth. He leaned forward, resting his hand gently over hers, stilling her needle. "I've known danger, Maggie. I've seen worse than Hale's bruised pride. What I hadn't seen in a long time was a reason to stand against it." His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "You are not the danger. You are the reason. You are." The attack came just before dawn, in the gray, liminal hour between night and day. Maggie was wrenched from sleep by the sharp, splintering crack of the back door being kicked in. Before her eyes were fully open, Ethan was on his feet, his revolver in his hand, his body a dark silhouette against the encroaching light. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice stripped of all its usual softness, leaving only cold, hard steel. A figure burst through the shattered doorway, a hired man from Laramie, his face obscured by a bandana, a shotgun raised. Ethan fired the blast, deafening in the small cabin. The shot went wide. The intruder lunged, tackling Ethan, and they crashed to the floor. Furniture splintered. The hearth spit sparks onto the small rug. Maggie screamed. The man drew a long, wicked-looking knife, slashing wildly. Ethan grunted in pain, taking a shallow cut to his side before he kicked the man off him, sending him stumbling backward. Blood soaked through his shirt, a dark stain spreading with terrifying speed. Seeing Ethan hurt ignited something primal in Maggie. All fear dissolved into a white-hot fury. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight solid and real in her hands, and swung it with all the force she could muster. The poker connected with the man's shoulder with a sickening thud. He cursed, reeling back, and clutching his arm, he fled through the broken door into the pre-dawn gloom. Ethan collapsed to his knees, one hand pressed hard against the wound in his side. "Ethan," Maggie cried, rushing to him. "I'm all right." He lied, his teeth clenched against the pain. He wasn't. The blood was flowing too freely. Panic seized her. She didn't stop to think. She didn't reach for her veil. She didn't care who saw her or what they thought. Barefoot and in her nightdress, she ran out of the cabin and into the cold morning air. The wind cutting through her thin clothes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ran toward town, her feet stumbling on the rocky path, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She burst into the center of Millstone Junction just as the first rays of sun were touching the tops of the buildings. A few early risers and late drinkers lingered on the saloon porch. Heads turned. They froze. "Help!" she shouted, her voice raw and breaking. "Please, somebody help. He's bleeding." She stood in the middle of the dusty street, her face uncovered for all to see, her hair a tangled mess, her nightdress stained with Ethan's blood. An unbearable silence fell. She could feel their eyes on her, on the scar on her desperation. Someone whispered, "It's her, Doyle's daughter." But this time, no one laughed. No one jeered. No one turned away. They looked, and they kept looking, and in their eyes, she saw not scorn, but shock. They saw not the name, not the scar, but the raw terror in her eyes, the tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. And in that moment, something in the heart of the town shifted. Within minutes, the blacksmith and 2 ranch hands were following her back to the cabin. They found Ethan barely conscious, a pool of blood darkening the floorboards around him. They lifted him onto the table, while Maggie knelt beside him, pressing a clean cloth against the wound, her hands soaked and shaking. "He needs a doctor," one of the men said gruffly. "Won't make it to Cheyenne." "Then we bring the doc here," the blacksmith declared, already heading for the door. When Maggie looked up again, she saw faces in the broken doorway. Townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stood there, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern. A woman she recognized from the store, Mrs. Gable, came in with a bucket of clean water and began to relight the fire. A young boy was sent to fetch more linens. They didn't ask questions, they just helped. And not a single one of them said a word about her scar. Ethan drifted in a feverish haze for nearly 3 days. The doctor from the next town over stitched the wound, but infection clung to him like a shroud. Maggie never left his side. She sponged his forehead with cool water-spooned broth between his cracked lips and changed the bandages with hands that trembled less each time she did it. She did not put on the veil again. There was no need, no room for shame or fear. There was only Ethan. The townsfolk came and went, leaving offerings on the porch, a loaf of still warm bread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of clean linens. Mrs. Gable returned with a hearty stew, her eyes full of a new quiet respect. The silence that settled over the cabin was no longer one of judgment, but of a shared fragile peace. On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan's fever broke. He opened his eyes, his breath shallow but steady. He looked at her, really looked, his gaze clear and focused. It held none of the confusion or pity she had dreaded, only the profound warmth of someone who had fought his way back to the world for one reason. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Maggie managed a small watery smile, brushing a damp strand of hair from his brow. "Of course I stayed." He watched her for a long time, his gaze drifting to the scar on her cheek, stark and pale in the morning light. A faint smile touched his lips. "You're still Maggie," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "Not a wound, not a secret, just Maggie." Her breath caught in her chest. The words were a balm on a hurt she hadn't known was still so raw. I used to think she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears that people only saw the mark. "I see the girl who stayed," he said simply. "That's all that matters." The days of his recovery were slow, but filled with a quiet, rebuilding purpose. Maggie planted onions and potatoes in a small plot of earth by the fence, her hands finding a surprising comfort in the rich soil. Ethan, leaning on a crutch, directed her as she helped him mend the hole in the roof. She brought him nails and held the ladder steady, and he taught her the difference between a king post and a rafter. They fell into a new, deeper rhythm, their lives weaving together, thread by thread. They began to talk more, filling the evenings with stories that did not hurt. She told him of the books she had loved as a child. He told her of his dream to one day see the ocean. They planned what sort of chickens they might buy next spring, arguing playfully over the merits of Leghorns versus Plymouth Rocks. One afternoon, a soft breeze carried the scent of wild lilac from the hill behind the cabin. Maggie followed it, drawn by a feeling of lightness she hadn't experienced since childhood. Ethan found her there an hour later, sitting in the tall grass, a half-finished crown of wildflowers in her lap. "You've got dirt on your face," he said, his voice laced with amusement as he sat down beside her. She looked at him at the healing cut on his cheek and the smudge of soot on his nose. So do you. They laughed, a real unburdened sound that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. Later that week, a light summer rain began to fall just as dusk was settling. The whole prairie glowed silver. Impulsively, Maggie climbed the ladder to the newly repaired roof, and Ethan, after a moment's hesitation, followed. They sat with their legs dangling over the edge, the gentle rhythmic drops soaking their hair and clothes. Maggie leaned back on her hands, tilting her face up to the sky, her eyes closed. Cold, Ethan asked, watching the rain trace paths down her cheek over the scar, making it glisten. No, she said, a serene smile on her face. It feels clean, like it's washing something old away. She was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a voice softer than the rain. I used to believe no one would ever look at me the way they look at other women. Ethan's gaze was steady. I never saw other women, he replied. She turned to him then, and the last barrier around her heart seemed to dissolve. The smile that lit her face was not timid or polite. It was radiant, transforming her features, making the scar not a disfigurement, but a part of a beautiful, resilient whole. Struck silent by the sight of it, Ethan could only stare. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, her fingers finding his and lacing through them. The rain kept falling, and neither of them moved. For the first time in her life, Maggie did not feel like she was being held together by fragile threads. She felt whole. The fragile peace was not destined to last. Whispers once confined to Millstone Junction began to travel, carried by stagecoach drivers' letters and traveling salesmen. The story of Richard Hale's public rejection and the subsequent defiance of the scarred woman and her quiet protector became a piece of frontier lore. And Richard heard it all. Each telling embellished the tale, casting him as the fool and Ethan McGraw as the hero. His rage, once hot, had cooled into something far more dangerous, a meticulous, vengeful obsession. He would not just punish them. He would reclaim what he saw as his rightful property and restore his reputation. He rode into town one crisp morning, dismounted before the sheriff's office, and declared loudly enough for half the town to hear that he had been too hasty. That Maggie Doyle, despite her family's unfortunate history, was his intended, and he would not see her honor compromised by living with an unmarried man. "This town will not shelter shame under my nose," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with false piety. "She belongs with a man who can restore her dignity. I will take her as my wife, with or without her consent." It was a declaration of war, not of love. It was about ownership power and the absolute refusal to be denied. 2 days later, Maggie's past arrived by train. Her mother, frail and trembling, stepped onto the platform, her face a mask of weary desperation. Behind her walked Daniel, Maggie's younger brother, now a tall, lanky boy of 16, with the same nervous eyes she remembered. They had been summoned by Richard Hale. They came straight to the cabin. When Maggie opened the door, her mother's eyes were already brimming with tears. "He's threatened us, Maggie," she whispered, her voice brittle as dry leaves. "He bought the note on our sponsor's land back east. He said if we don't bring you back to him, he'll see us put out on the street. Homeless." Maggie stared, her heart turning to a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "He has no right." "No," her mother agreed, her voice breaking. "But he has power, and we have none." Inside, Ethan remained in the corner of the room, sharpening a knife, his movements unnaturally still. He listened, his silence a heavy weight in the small cabin, the air thick with the impossible choice that now faced Maggie. That night, she sat on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest, watching the sky bleed into shades of purple and rose over the plains. The veil lay forgotten in a chest inside. Her face was free, but her heart was cage-torn between the family she was bound to by blood and duty, and the man who had given her a life, a love she never thought possible. Ethan stepped outside and sat beside her, the wooden step groaning under his weight. They sat without speaking for a long while, the chirping of crickets the only sound. "I cannot let them lose everything because of me," Maggie finally whispered into the twilight. "I know," Ethan said, his voice low and rough. "I should go." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "If that's what you feel you have to do." Her lips trembled. She turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Do you want me to go?" His voice was quiet, but held an unshakable firmness. "More than anything, I want you to stay." He turned to face her, his gaze steady and intense. "But I won't keep you like a prize won in a fight. You are free, Maggie. This place, this life we've started, it's your home, if you choose it." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the face of the man who had fought for her, not with fists, but with respect. Who had seen her as whole, not as something to be fixed. "You make it so hard to leave," she whispered. "I'll always make it hard to leave," he replied. She stood then, and walked out into the darkness, away from the cabin, away from her family, to be alone with the weight of her decision. Morning came, painting the eastern sky in strokes of pale gold. When Ethan opened the front door, he found her already outside, tending the fire under the coffee pot, her back to the road. Her veil was nowhere in sight. "I told them no," she said without turning around. He saw her shoulders rise and fall with a quiet, resolute breath. "They cried. My mother begged. Daniel." He just looked lost. She finally turned, and her eyes, though shadowed with sadness, held a new unyielding strength. "But I will not trade one prison for another. My place is here." Her gaze met his, clear and direct. "Not because of duty or obligation. Because of what I feel when I look at you." He stepped forward, and she moved into his arms, burying her face in his chest. The decision was made. But they both knew Richard Hale would not accept it. As dawn broke gray and heavy, a storm brewing on the horizon, Ethan saw them. 6 riders, dark figures against the pale sky, circling the edge of the property like wolves. Richard Hale was at their head. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and violent, swirling dust under their horses' hooves. "Get inside," Ethan said to Maggie, his voice calm, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Take Daniel to the barn. Stay low and stay away from the windows." She nodded, her face pale but determined. She grabbed her brother's hand and ran for the relative safety of the barn. Ethan moved with a grim efficiency he had learned in the war. He checked his revolver, grabbed his rifle, and took his position behind a stone wall. He was not a man who sought violence, but he was a man who knew how to meet it. Richard's men came hard, their shouts lost in the rising wind. The first crack of a rifle shot split the air. Ethan fired back from cover, his shot true. One man cried out, clutching his arm, his horse rearing in panic. From the barn, Maggie watched her heart in her throat. She held Daniel close, shielding him with her body, but her eyes were fixed on Ethan. She was no longer just the frightened woman from the train platform. She was a woman defending her home. "You think you can protect her from me, you landless cur?" Richard roared, his voice laced with fury. He spurred his horse forward, firing wildly toward the stone wall. Ethan held his ground, firing methodically, making every shot count. But he was outnumbered. 2 riders broke off, circling to flank him from the west. Just as they neared the cottonwoods, one of Ethan's traps sprang. A tripwire, almost invisible in the low light, sent a heavy log rolling down a slight incline. One horse went down with a scream, throwing its rider. The other man, startled, was a clear target. Ethan fired, and a second rider fell. Seeing her chance, Maggie acted. She grabbed an oil lantern from a hook, her hands steady. With a prayer on her lips, she lit the wick and hurled it with all her might into the dry hay of an empty stall, near where Hale's men had tied their spare horses. Flames erupted with a hungry roar. Sparks leaped, and the dry hay ignited like gunpowder. The barn filled with thick, acrid smoke. Horses screamed in terror, pulling at their tethers. The carefully orchestrated attack dissolved into chaos. Ethan used the confusion to his advantage, rushing from cover to shove a man off Maggie's path as he tried to get to the fire. In the smoke and turmoil, a flaming roof beam crashed down. Ethan pushed Maggie and Daniel clear, but the end of the beam caught him, sending him to the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He cried out, clutching his side, where an old wound had been reopened by the impact. The approaching storm finally broke. Rain began to lash down, turning the dusty yard to slick, treacherous mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very earth. Through the sheeting rain and smoke, Richard Hale saw his victory slipping away. He tried to turn his horse to retreat and regroup, but his moment of hesitation was his undoing. Over the roar of the thunder, a voice high and clear screamed from the direction of the cabin, "Richard Hale." He turned. It was Maggie. She stood in the doorway, her face streaked with soot, her eyes blazing. And in that moment, Richard lost his composure. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. "This is for my father," he shrieked, his voice cracking with a generation of hate. "Colonel Alistair Hale. A name your traitor father sent to his grave. Samuel Doyle sold the Union plans for the ambush at Willow Creek. My father died in that trap because of him. You are the last piece of his legacy, and I came here to destroy you just as he destroyed my family." The revelation hit Maggie with the force of a physical blow. Her father. A man responsible for this. The locket around her neck suddenly felt like it was burning her skin. But there was no time to process it. In the barn, a section of the burning roof collapsed, trapping her brother. Daniel screamed, his voice thin with terror. Ethan, dragging his injured leg, tried to get to him, but collapsed in the mud, his face pale with pain. Maggie's world narrowed to an impossible choice, the man she loved bleeding in the mud, or her brother about to be consumed by flames. The bravery her father had asked of her so long ago surged through her. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was the master of her present. Ignoring the flames licking at her dress, she ran into the burning barn. She heaved a fallen timber aside, her muscles screaming in protest, and pulled her terrified brother from the debris, pushing him out into the rain, just as the main roof gave way, with a final deafening crash. She stumbled out into the yard, coughing, her eyes streaming. Richard Hale, momentarily forgotten, stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. That was his mistake. Ethan, propped on one elbow, his eyes blazing with a defiant fire, raised his revolver. He took careful aim and fired. The bullet struck Hale in the shoulder, knocking him from his saddle into the mud. His remaining men froze, their will to fight broken. The air crackled with the hiss of rain on embers, the smell of smoke, and a profound silence. One of Hale's men dropped his weapon. The fight was over. As townsfolk began to arrive, drawn by the gunshots and the pillar of smoke, they saw an astonishing sight. They saw Maggie, her face bare and marked by soot and tears, dragging the wounded Ethan from the mud, her young brother clinging to her skirt. Richard Hale lay groaning on the ground, but no one moved to help him. The new town sheriff, a grizzled man named Brody, took in the scene, his eyes lingering on Maggie's face, not with scorn, but with something akin to awe. Maggie knelt in the mud, cradling Ethan's head in her lap. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Please, just stay with me." Ethan stirred, his voice a faint rasp. "Knew you would." She bent low, pressing his hand to her lips. "You are my home," she whispered. As the rain began to soften, washing the soot from her face, a new day dawned, not just on the horizon, but in the heart of a woman who had finally found her own name. The smoke settled low over the scorched earth, mingling with the steam rising from the rain-soaked ground. Ash floated in the air like dark, silent snow. In the center of the ravaged farmyard, Maggie knelt in the mud, oblivious to the small crowd that had gathered, their faces pale and stunned in the gray morning light. Her world was the man in her arms, the faint, ragged rhythm of his breathing. A hush had fallen. The men who had once spat at her name stood silent, and their hats clutched in their hands. The women who had turned their backs now dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The Sheriff Brody walked over to where Richard Hale lay, his fine suit ruined with mud and blood, and nudged him with his boot. "Get up, Hale," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You've got a lot to answer for." Two ranchers stepped forward to haul a groaning Richard to his feet. No one spoke to Maggie, but their silence was no longer a weapon. It was a shroud of respect. Then a single figure broke from the circle. It was Mrs. Gable, her face etched with concern. She knelt beside Maggie, a damp cloth in her hand, and without asking permission, began to gently clean the blood from Ethan's temple. "Let me help, child," the old woman said softly. Maggie looked up, her eyes wide and startled. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. A murmur went through the crowd, soft but clear on the damp air. "She's not the daughter of a trader," a man in a rancher's coat said, his voice filled with a rough wonder. "She's the bravest woman in this territory." Maggie heard him. Her chest tightened and her hand closed fiercely around Ethan's. His breath rattled shallow and labored. He tried to open his eyes, his fingers lifting weakly toward her cheek. She caught his hand, guiding his rough palm to the side of her face, pressing it against her skin. "Ethan, I'm here," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe." A faint smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. His eyes fluttered open just enough to see her. Really see her. "No one," he rasped the words like wind through dry leaves, "ever told you." His thumb brushed gently over the scar. "You're beautiful." Her breath hitched. A sob held back for a lifetime broke free, shaking her entire body. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his tears, falling freely onto his shirt, mingling with the rain and the soot. "You came for me," he whispered. "Always," she replied, the word a sacred vow. "I will always come for you." Her mother and Daniel stepped forward, their faces streaked with tears of their own. Her mother reached out her hand, hovering over Maggie's shoulder, before resting there, a light, trembling touch. "Margaret," she whispered the name, full of a new broken pride. "I am so sorry." Maggie didn't look up, but she reached back and squeezed her mother's hand. The past was not erased, but its power was broken. They carried Ethan into the cabin, which, though scorched and damaged, still stood strong. The town doctor was summoned again. Over the next few weeks, the people of Millstone Junction, in a silent collective act of penance and admiration, helped them rebuild. Men came with lumber and nails to repair the barn. Women arrived with food, medicine, and quilts. Richard Hale was gone, taken by federal marshals to Cheyenne to face charges, his name spoken only in hushed, cautionary tones. Maggie's mother and Daniel stayed long enough to see her settled before deciding to make their own way west, free from the shadow of Richard Hale for good. One clear autumn morning, weeks later, when the air was crisp and the aspens on the hills had turned to gold, Maggie walked to the small, unmarked cemetery on the edge of town. The wounds on the land and on Ethan had begun to heal. She stood before a simple wooden cross, marking a traveler's grave, and took the silver locket from around her neck. She held it in her palm, the metal worn smooth by years of anxious touch. She thought of her father, of Richard Hale's accusation, and of the complex, painful truth of legacy. Her father may have made terrible choices, but he had also given her the strength to be brave. She was his daughter, but she was not his sin. With a quiet prayer, she dug a small hole in the earth with her bare hands and placed the locket inside. As she covered it with dirt, she felt a final profound weight lift from her soul. She was no longer defined by Samuel Doyle's name, but by her own actions. When she turned to leave, Ethan was waiting for her by the gate, leaning on a cane, but standing tall. He had the wagon hitched, packed with their few belongings. They had decided to leave, not because they were running, but because the world was wide, and their story was their own, to write now. He didn't speak as she approached. He simply watched her, his eyes full of a love that needed no words. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, not the scar, but the skin right next to it. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a love for her. The whole person. The brave, resilient woman who had walked through fire and found herself. She smiled a true and radiant smile and took his hand. Together, they climbed into the wagon and turned it west toward the setting sun and a future that was finally, blessedly their own.